Today, I'm talking with Clare about moving through grief and understanding how personality type can help us do that. Hi, Clare. It's great to have you.
Hi, Samantha. How are you today?
Good, thank you. I'm very
Good.
excited. I've been looking forward to our chat for weeks now. I think there's a lot
That's
to
good.
learn and unpack and discover from your research, and just like personality type can offer us so much. And I don't think we always think about it in a practical lens like grief. And I'm really looking forward to diving into that.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it does. It affects everything. I always say I'm unhealthily biased towards personality because it affects every part of our lives, including how we grieve.
Yeah, every part of our lives. So today we're going to be getting a little more into understanding your background. We're going to chat about redefining grief, about the research you've done, which I'm really interested in. And then we're going to get into the personality and how different elements of personality grieve, and how we can get stuck in different places of grief, and how I understand personality can help us get out of that and get unstuck.
Yeah, it's a good tool.
So let's learn more about you. Tell me more about how long you've been using personality type, how you got involved in grief, and when and how sort of this research came about.
Yeah, well, it's sort of all mixed up a bit there. I got involved with personality type back in the mid-80s. It was fairly early on in the days in type in New Zealand, and our community had been virtually wiped out with a flood. And our house was one of the few houses that wasn't, so it became sort of like Grand Central for community support and help. And we also had another family come and live with us, so we had 5 children under 4 with us, and so that was put anybody into grief. But just I learned about type then, and it just made sense. It made sense of the situation we were living in at the moment. It made sense of, the whole dynamics of relationships we were suddenly thrown amongst at that time. And so since then, I've just built on my understanding of type. I became qualified as a Myers-Briggs type indicator, a qualified practitioner back in 1999, and I use it in my business practice all the time. So in terms of the grief, I've got a nursing background, and was particularly working in the area with cardiac, so you're dealing naturally with a lot of grief. Once I left nursing and had my own family, I did counselling training, so again, working with grief. And then I was invited in our local region to set up the spiritual support first, and then work with the family support and grief support. And that's when I did a lot more of my own research, looking at grief through the lens of type.
And I remember you telling some stories about really just seeing all these different approaches to grief through that work in the hospice and in that part of your life.
Yes, that's right. That so many of the books are written from one perspective, and it's understandable, because a lot of people that are working in grief work are a particular alignment of personality type. I mean, for those of our listeners that actually know type, it's those with intuitive and feeling functions, that combination. And so a lot of the work was written from that perspective. And I realized that didn't fit for everyone. And so that's why I got interested in doing a bit more research myself and reading myself around type.
Yes, and so you are an ENFP, since we're talking personality type here, and an Enneagram 2. Obviously, we're not talking about Enneagram today. We are just focusing more on the Myers-Briggs system. And for those of you who like to know, I'm an ENTP. And so we're similar, but very different in our approaches to understanding and exploring grief. That thinking, feeling thing can make a huge difference in the way we approach our understanding of grief, which we'll learn more about later on.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So let's talk about redefining grief, because I think a lot of us start off by thinking grief is just what follows when someone close to us dies, that real sense of large, overwhelming loss. And then that's it. that's the only realm in which sort of grief applies, and yet there's so much more to it than that.
Yeah, you're right. I run a lot of understanding loss and grief workshops, and the workshops I primarily run are for those, just the general public, not for grief specialists, but just so that the general public, general Joe Blogs, can understand what grief is. And whenever I ask, how do you define grief, I always get exactly as you've said, Samantha. It's that those overwhelming feelings of sadness when somebody dies or somebody close to you, something bad happens. The way that I like to define it is that, yes, that is right, but it's so much wider than that. That the way I define it is grief is any response to any loss. So it can be like we've got here on the slides, where you've lost your job or you're moving house, you've had to move house, move area. It can be a relationship breakdown or financial hardship. Any of the things that are mentioned here can kick us into a grief response because we've had a loss. And so our emotional response to that is what naturally follows.
Which leads me to think that we're all experiencing a lot more grief than we realize, because we have these losses in our lives on a very regular basis, because change is quite constant,
Yeah, you're right. And I think particularly now, as we're in this global pandemic, and while we're very fortunate about what's going on in our country, and especially as we see the devastation that COVID has caused in other countries, we are still affected by some means. And like for me personally, I've got a daughter and son-in-law and 4 grandchildren in Switzerland that it's the longest time I've never been able to see them. And I grieve that. I miss them. And I've got these 11-year-old granddaughters that are saying, we miss you, we just want to see you. And so even that in the midst of what we're doing now, and COVID has affected everyone in so many different ways, there's been losses amongst it.
I think one thing that I know I found difficult, but also when you sort of look more widely, is that the grief and the sadness seems to go hand in hand with like happiness as well, or some sort of positive emotion. Yep. And that can be really confusing. Like when I was made redundant, I was both relieved and frustrated and worried. And I was like, I should be excited. This is both a good thing, but I'm upset by the way I've been treated. And it's almost like I got stuck because of these conflicting or confusing emotions.
Yes. Yeah. And I think you're right. And a classic is when people move house, for example. They could be in this this area, and they've got friends and neighbors around that they've built relationship with, but they're really excited about what they're moving into and the new journey ahead, but they still grieve the sadness of the loss of what they had in the last. So it's almost as though it can walk down 2 tracks at the same time in some situations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if you have an answer for this. It's just something I've been wondering lately, is what happens for people as we get older, as we carry all this ungrieved or unresolved loss and grief around with us? Like, how does that affect us on a long-term basis?
And I think that is often the case, and especially with our ancestral history, especially those of us that come from a European British history. Sometimes it's our grief has been taught to shove it down and have the stiff upper lip approach. And so it comes out in other ways, and it can come out physically in our body or mentally through anxiety and depression. It will show up eventually. And I think that's why, in New Zealand, I think we're really blessed to have our Māori culture and our Pacifica culture that actually allow grief more naturally. I think as we work together as cultures, we can just learn so much from each other in this area. Well, I think we can learn so much from our Māori and Pacifica people around healthy grieving and not pushing it down as we've been taught. I've also noted, I remember when I was in the early days of working in the hospice, I read an article about grief for older people, and it talked about, like by the time, especially when somebody elderly loses their lifelong partner or somebody very special, they sometimes just do not have the energy to grieve anymore. And I saw that with my mother, when my father died, that she just didn't have the energy to do it. It's going to be my turn soon, so I can move on. But I think especially when we're younger, I think it's really important to deal with it. Otherwise, it'll deal with you.
Yeah. And it is a very energy intensive process, regardless of how the scale of the loss, really. And I don't think we really appreciate that as much as we need to, and the effect it can have on us.
Yeah, I remember reading somewhere that if we lose somebody significant in our lives, or we go through, like as you talked about, a redundancy of a job that we've loved, or and we can't see light at the end of the tunnel, it's equivalent emotionally and physiologically to your body as having a limb cut off. And
that is huge.
like if somebody has an amputation of a limb, we expect that to take a long time and a huge adjustment. But so often, because you can't see grief, we expect people to get over it a lot faster, or we expect ourselves to get over it. We try and justify it, and whereas it's massive. It has a massive effect on our bodies. And in saying that too, I think one of the things that I struggle with in our culture is that we see grief as something abnormal, but it is actually a normal part of life, and it's allowing it to have that normalcy rather than actually trying to push it away as though it's something that's abnormal.
Yeah, because like referring culturally, the Western culture's become very disconnected from death, and therefore having a more comfortable relationship with grief, both in that context and therefore in other contexts. Whereas, as you say, there are other cultures that are still more comfortable with that and can show a different way. And that is really interesting, because yes, if you're culturally, if your culture says grief is bad, it's abnormal, you then try and push it away and you forget that it exists. And as I've been looking at all how do you know that you're grieving? The physical symptoms can look like what we in the Western culture could say, what's having a bad day? I'm irritable, I'm angry, I've got nausea, I've got a headache. We don't think grief. We think I'm stressed or having a bad day, or, something like that. And yet so much of grief comes out in these sort of physical symptoms.
Yes, you're right. Yeah. And that's where, the personality type lens was really helpful, because different types, it will show up in different symptoms. Like, for example, somebody that is their dominant type is thinking, and they make their decisions very logically using their thinking function, they can just become tired mentally, because they're trying to work it all out, and it just, their symptoms of loss can just be overwhelming tiredness and brain fog, for example.
That explains my last week. Maybe that was what was happening to me last week.
What was going on?
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so let's get into it then. So I think that sort of leads in here to say that there are different forms of grieving, and the two that we've pointed out here is one, expressing emotions, and the other is taking action. But there's a whole spectrum in between, which we're going to get into.
Yes.
But it's not just crying as the only way to grieve.
And some people can't cry. They just find it really, really hard to cry. And it's not necessarily that they don't want to cry. Some people just don't want to cry, but it's not them.
But crying isn't necessary to effectively grieve.
You're right.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your research. What led you to do this research, and how did it go? And then we're going to get into the findings.
It's initially what I was doing research back in the early 2000s, and I was gathering data of people that I was working with, because I realized there was just nothing out there virtually in the type world around grief. And so that's where I started. And then we just went into this real, walk the talk girl, where my nephew was killed, my father was diagnosed with terminal cancer, my favorite aunt died, and we just went into this series of years of just kaleidoscoping and they were all deaths. But there were other losses going on around all this at the same time, really, of everyday sort of losses. So it meant that the whole research just got put on the back burner, really. And then, but what activated this, and back then, we didn't have the internet availability quite the same to do research, or I wasn't so savvy on the internet, was probably one of the big reasons as well. But even just to interview people on Zoom and do things like that was not such an option. And so, and then I've been invited with different conferences around the world to do the presentation of the material I had, and from my experience also from working in the hospice. But also then I thought, oh man, I can do this. And then Dr. Jane Kesey, who is one of the type specialists in the States, she encouraged me to do the online survey, and it just made it so much easier. And she helped me set that up, and that's where we came to with the research.
And so you essentially just asked that single question: what is your response to loss?
Yeah, I asked that, and then I asked. That was the first question, because I just wanted to get people's off the top of their heads response. And then in the early stages of your grief, did you? And then I divided it into the lenses of dominant function of type. So do you need to do something? Do you need to find meaning and purpose? And I'll just go into this questions, because when you look at the Survey Monkey, you don't get all the questions. But the first question is, do you need to do something physical and or tangible, e.g. cleaning, planning, running, gardening, something very physical, or do you need to find meaning and or spiritual connection in what has happened, e.g. prayer, like candles, reflection, meditation, and asking that question, the why question of meaning, or do you need to find intellectual answers and understanding in what has happened and wanting the answers, and that's sort of the why question, answering the intellect, and the how question, and the final, or do you need to be able to express your emotional response freely, privately with others, either privately, or with others, e.g. feeling overwhelmed, emotion, crying a lot, etc. And so I wanted to get people sort of what is your first up sort of response in those early days and weeks of when you suddenly get hit with a big loss. So, and then I asked people to if they could give an example of their response.
Right.
And that's what was really, really helpful. Yeah.
And when I looked at the types and how each type grieved, some people covered all styles. It wasn't just necessarily the dominant type. There were trends, obviously, but people still needed to use all different ways, because you never know what each loss and how each loss is going to need to be grieved.
And I think in the process, people use all styles. The trend overall is that a particular type will use a particular style. But in saying that, if you've got somebody that's very, very well developed, you know, like they might have a dominant thinking function that is very well developed, and they know that the opposite, their feeling function, is what needs attention in this situation. They might just be able to walk quite easily through the thinking process, but it's that they need to focus on the feeling function. And so that's where the energy needs to go.
And that's that last point here on the slide, that some people get stuck in their grief, usually one of 4 areas. It's often that least developed part of the personality that they can get stuck in, but not always, but sometimes.
No. Yeah. Or, you know, like I know when my nephew was killed and he was 18, it just came like out of the blocks for us. And it took me a long time. My dominant function is intuition, which aligns with looking for meaning and purpose. And it took me a long time to find any sense of meaning in this that fitted for me. And so that stuck me. And it's almost as though I could not cry until I found some meaning. And then sort of once then, it was like the floodgates opened for me, because my second function is feeling. So that emotional response is still up there for me. But it was as though I was like the stunned mullet for so long. Just doing what needed to be done until I found that meaning.
So let's talk about these 4 centers and understand both the dominant aspects of the personality that we're talking about, but also a little bit more background, because it both relates to personality, but we see the same model conveyed in many different ways, and one of which is this pies model, which I know you referred to when we were initially talking about this. Can you tell me a little more about it?
Yeah, well, I was introduced to it when I was working at the hospice. It's used a lot in the hospice. It's used a lot in the Māori world, and I can, apologies to those of Te Reo. I think is it Te Wharo, that is where there's the 4 pillars. I'm sure I'm not saying that right, but it's the 4 pillars, and it's used a lot in the health centre. It's slightly different, but you know, I found the pies model is an easy model to grasp, you know, because it's taking that holistic look at our physical response, our intellectual or mental response, our emotional or psychological response, and a spiritual response. And I find that different types of people naturally default first and foremost to one of the others before they'll do all 4. Often, not everybody does all 4, but they will lean into one more strongly. They give more weight to one than the other.
So just to take it out of the grief setting for a minute and think of it in terms of healthcare, when someone goes to their doctor or gets a diagnosis, they might respond with one of these more strongly before they can then do the others.
Yeah. Like, for example, somebody goes to a doctor with a diagnosis, and like if they've got first and foremost a thinking function, they'll want to know the detail of, okay, so what's happening? What does this look like? What are the symptoms? What do I do about it? And it's almost a very objective, standardized, and dong 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 dong, you know, getting it in order. Somebody primarily physically will actually just be feeling the physical symptoms, and all I want you to do is sort out the physical symptoms, you know, and they don't even necessarily care about the why under it. That might come later. You know, if it's a hard diagnosis, somebody with an emotional response, that will overwhelm them. Or equally, if they're feared a hard diagnosis and they find that they're fine, they want to go out and celebrate and enjoy it, and you know, they'll feel the joy and the relief of that. And then the more the spiritual is around the meaning and the purpose, and it's sort of like looking at you know, so what's going on here, how does all this work, but more under the surface, subjective rather than objective point of view, in a sense.
And that asking why piece is a lot connected to that finding meaning and purpose. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So if we just then connect the dots between these 4 centers and personality, when we talk about physical, we're often talking about sensing, we're talking about intellectual, we're talking about thinking, emotional is feeling, and spiritual is intuition. Now, I wasn't necessarily going to go into a lot of an introduction to personality here, but maybe for the context of what's coming in terms of grief, it might be useful to explain this a little bit. Did you want to do that?
Explain more what you're asking, sorry.
Oh, just because we haven't really explained what, sensing, thinking, feeling, and intuition mean if someone doesn't fully understand that.
Okay, yeah. And this is taken from the work of type from Carl Jung back in the early 1900s, and looking at our personality and how our brain works in one of 2 ways. We take in information and we process information. And so we either take in information using our sensing function primarily, and that's around detail and data and that kind of thing, or we take in information through our intuition function, which is much more like using the 6th sense. Sensing uses the 5 senses, intuition is using the 6th sense, and it's looking for connection and meaning and how things link together. And then we process that information. Our brain processes that information, and it's either using the thinking function, which it's like it takes it out there and looks at it objectively, and then actually organizes it from there, analyzes it, and understands it from that objective point of view. The feeling function, people process the information they've taken in, taking it into themselves in a sense, so it's much more subjective based on their values and how it impacts them and others. And then how we function as a whole person is that combination of those primarily. We do all of the combinations, but it's like being left-handed or right-handed. What is our natural preference?
And so of these 4, one of them will be dominant, and one of them will be our least preferred, which is usually its opposite. So if you're a dominant intuitive person, you'll be less likely to use or be comfortable with your sensing function. And if you're dominant feeling, you'll be less comfortable with that thinking part of your personality. Yeah. And vice versa.
Yeah. And it seems it's a natural inborn way of being.